So I'll do the in the cloud. That works?
Yeah.
And then si quieres, Christian, quitarle. De todas maneras, lo que voy a hacer es que puedo editarlo.
Yeah.
So si quieres.
I don't think it'll show this part though, but it should be fine.
Oh, okay, because I see the I see tu presentación y se fue César, ya no lo veo.
It should be here. See? Yeah. He's there. I see him. All right. So ready?
Wait. Yeah, I mean, I'm recording, pero can you stop sharing for a moment?
Yeah.
So I can
sharing.
Yeah,
I can see both. I can see both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So ahorita está in the speaker. Entonces everyone will start moving. Bueno, yo tengo the speaker. It doesn't really matter. Pero okay, I can edit it también después if we need to edit. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start. I don't know if I should start. Well, I was recording already. Pero ya no puedo borrarlo y volver a empezar. No, right? No. Nomás let's start recording. Okay. So hello, everyone. How's everyone doing today? I'm really excited to be in this virtual space with two colleagues and friends. Today I'm joining, or we're joining in this virtual roundtable on the land of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. For me, it is a truly honor to present the work of two doctoral candidates and friends who are today for this NAISA regional gathering to share their amazing research with us. This presentation in a way serves the purpose to share with La Red FOLINAY and other communities how language and literature are spaces of decolonization and healing. First, I would like to introduce Christian Ramírez. Christian Ramírez is a first-year doctoral student in the history department at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research mainly focuses on the 19th century indigenous peoples, particularly the Nahuas of Guerrero, and how they used popular liberalism during the Porfiriato to fight for the political rights and autonomy of their pueblos. I also have César Barreras, Yoeme Yaqui. César is a citizen of the transborder Yaqui peoples of Sonora and Arizona. He's a doctoral student in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA, currently studying language ideologies and praxis, language and cultural roles, and maintaining ethnic identity and promoting mental health and well-being. Welcome both Christian and César, and I think we can start with Christian, if you can share your screen, and I will mute myself and I will allow you to present your work.
Thank you, Cindy. So let us begin. Mexico at the founding of the nation was highly indigenous. States like Guerrero had a roughly 80% indigenous population at the eve of the Mexican Revolution. Today, by the official Mexican census, it is around 15%. However, as many of us know, those numbers cannot be trusted as the state's restricted categories limit who can be considered indigenous. Nevertheless, those numbers are shocking. Mexico went in 2 centuries from a visible, plural, diverse nation of many languages to now where Spanish roughly dominates, and many indigenous languages are endangered or have become extinct, such as the Cuitlateco of Guerrero, which the last fluent speaker died in the 1960s. But where does this begin? Where does this attempt to eradicate language diversity first start? One possible answer is education. The audience is most likely familiar with figures like José Vasconcelos and his infamous La Raza Cósmica, which champions racial miscegenation between white people and indigenous people to the peril of indigenous culture. As José Vasconcelos was the first Secretary of Public Education from 1920 to 1923, and thereafter continued to influence the political and cultural landscape of Mexico, his ideas of mestizaje would help facilitate the loss of indigenous culture through the use of state-funded education. However, these ideals did not start with Vasconcelos. Earlier ideas of eliminating Mexico's indigenous plural linguistic heritage through the use of education and literature can be found in the words of Mexico's most famous indigenous author, writer, Ignacio Altamirano. Who was Ignacio Altamirano? Ignacio Altamirano was born in 1834 in the city of Tixla, in the area that is now the state that is now known as Guerrero. His father was the mayor of Tixla. From this background, the young Chantal Nahuatl speaker attained the highest levels of education, a power that the average indigenous Mexican in the 19th century could scarcely hope to achieve. This type of trajectory is only comparable to a few other indigenous people during this period. One other contemporary and fellow indigenous liberal was that of Benito Juarez. Like Juarez, Altamirano was trained in schools that were exclusively Eurocentric. Indeed, Altamirano was sent to Mexico City, where the greatest Mexican thinkers of the time, such as Ignacio Altamirano, instructed him. Altamirano was not just a scholar and prolific writer, he was a soldier and politician. Altamirano participated in all the major wars of Mexican history during his adult lifetime and would hold many political offices, including the president of the Supreme Court. Therefore, Altamirano's influence on Mexico's history, culture, society, and politics cannot be overlooked. While similar to Juarez, Altamirano's views on indigenous people were less problematic. Altamirano, for all his faults, argued for the entire inclusion of indigenous people into the Mexican state, something Juarez and the other liberal elites were not entirely in agreement. However, Altamirano believed that indigenous people could only become proper citizens if they adhered to good liberal values. These liberal values meant the destruction of much of the indigenous cultures in Mexico through and the acceptance of European European hegemonic culture above all else. A model that fully elaborates on his vision is his book El Zarco, which I argue is instrumental guide for the liberal order in ending linguistic pluralism indigenous pluralism for a single homogeneous mestizo culture and language based solely on Spanish. So the book. Ignacio Altamirano in his life wrote several books, and his three most famous of his works being Clemencia, La Navidad en las Montañas, and El Zarco. But for the purpose of this presentation, we will focus solely on El Zarco. El Zarco was written around the time of the Porfiriato, a period where the dismantling of indigenous communal land tenure was rapidly advancing. Indigenous participation in politics and in the liberal order was at an all-time low. I argue that El Zarco is a book that seeks to remedy that situation. However, not for the sake of linguistic or cultural plurality, but to finally answer the so-called Indian problem. Ignacio Altamirano's revolutionary idea was mestizaje. However, this was not entirely in the biological sense, but mostly cultural. Ignacio Altamirano's ideas were presented quite clear in the book that he sees it as the necessary steps for indigenous people to become part of the nation state. This call for mestizaje is visible with the setting of the story, the town of Yuatepec. Yuatepec is described as a place both European and American. The soil is native, but the value of the products, the oranges and lemons, is foreign. Native body, European thought. The setting is presented as an ideal community, utopic. Meanwhile, the location of the enemy of the story, El Zarco, Xochiminacas, is presented as a backwards den for racial plurality that violates the natural liberal order. Many of these characters in Xochiminacas are described or coded as Black and or indigenous, minus El Zarco, who is seen as a dangerous, stupid white man who uses his brown and Black hordes to plunder Yuatepec. Therefore, the destruction of this triumph and the triumph of the people of Yuatepec should be seen as an allegory where mestizaje needs to win out for liberalism to survive and flourish against the old colonial regime. The same colonial regime that paradoxically protected indigenous identity while ever exploiting them. Liberalism, however, would seek to end that, but keep the exploitation. Another important factor is the protagonist in El Zarco. The protagonist is Nicolás, the indigenous blacksmith. Several scholars have argued that he's a stand-in for the writer himself. Ignacio Altamirano became a writer and politician. However, he stated had he not, he would have become a blacksmith. The similarities between the two characters, between the character and the writer, do not end there. Another crucial term that Altamirano referred to himself is that of an ugly, so-called indio feo, the ugly Indian, something he uses to describe Nicolás several times in the novel. And the final similarity, Yuatepec is set in Morelos, so that the language that Nicolás's family spoke was most likely Nahuatl, like Altamirano's. Why are these similarities important though? Well, they have to do with the fact that despite being indigenous, both men became, in Altamirano's mind, the good liberal citizens. Altamirano also saw a reality that because most indigenous people would not have access to education like he did, an alternative for that was for them to be engaged in respectable, productive jobs like blacksmithing, which contributes to the overall economic production of the nation state. It is interesting to see the hero protagonist as an indigenous person and the villain antagonist, El Zarco, as a white man. Representation is important. That needs to be stressed. However, readers need to be careful when closely looking at Nicolas and what he represents. Nicolas is an orphan and was raised in Yoatepec, a mestizo town, and it is implied he has no ties to his indigenous community. There is no implication that he has any bonds to other indigenous people, nor his culture. There is a reason for that. For you see, Altamirano has made Nicolas as the perfect indigenous liberal subject, one who has no attachments to his culture, his people, his pueblo, or language. Without these colonial restraints, as liberals viewed indigeneity as a sign of backwardness, Nicolas can achieve his highest potential. Nicolas is not bound to the land of Yoatepec because to Altamirano, he sees indigenous attachments to their ancestral lands as burdens that stops them from becoming productive, good, liberal citizens, such as the fictional Nicolas. Nicolas, without any ties to language, culture, or land, he finds ultimately happiness by marrying the good mestiza, Pilar, and is able to create a happily ever after with her, with the most likely probability of them having mestizo children who will share the similar features of their father, but with no ties to their indigenous heritage. Thus, if indigenous people follow in the footsteps of either Altamirano or Nicolas, then they too can enjoy in the fruits of liberalism at the cost of their languages, traditions, and identity. So, significance in conclusion. This presentation has demonstrated how El Zarco, through its setting, themes, and characters, aim to create a moral, correct solution in incorporating indigenous people into the nation through liberalization. However, this prescription in modern terms can be seen nothing less as cultural genocide. It should be no surprise that the ideas of El Zarco will be welcomed by indigenous elites like Ignacio Altamirano or Benito Juarez, who both did nothing to stem the tide and the obliteration of linguistic indigenous morality and sought instead for its erasure. Through their training in Eurocentric schools that espoused the purported supremacy of white European culture, as well as becoming successes from becoming members of the liberal elite, they sought to emulate that for other indigenous people. However, as indigenous people both then and now have seen, the fruits of liberalism and now neoliberalism yield little rewards for the abandonment of their language and culture. Thus, the best method to combat such erasure comes from the same systems that used to destroy the multi-pluralist linguistic landscape of Mexico, such as education. It was education that allowed Altamirano and Juarez to gain success, but also the idea is to abolish the indigenous ways of living. Thus, to rectify such errors, indigenous communities, the pueblos themselves, should be given more access and control over education, especially in regards to the education of their own people. How that is to play that is not for me to say, but something indigenous communities, not just here in Mexico, but across the world must answer for themselves so as to maintain their cultures, traditions, and languages. Thank you. And I would like to give some acknowledgements to obviously for the communities, indigenous communities in Nayarit for hosting this, as well as NAISA, the communities that I come from those in Guerrero and the United States, my advisors, Fernando Perez Montesinos and Patricia Arroyo Calderon, my family, and also my ancestors. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for that wonderful presentation. We're now going to transition to César's presentation, and then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. And also, we can ask questions to each other, okay? Thank you. Adelante, César.
So again, Christian, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. We really enjoyed it. Like Cindy was saying, my name is César Barreras, and it is a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to be presenting on a topic that is very near and dear to my community. As a member of the transborder Yoeme people, also known as the Yaqui, reflecting on ideologies and issues revolving around the aspect of language revitalization and its effects is something that I am very interested in, but not necessarily framing it. I think we all have heard at one point in time or another that there are specific healing properties that language reclamation has. However, I feel I have criticized the usage of the word healing in the past because it's thrown around very lightly as if it's some sort of metaphor. But I really want to analyze what are the impacts and dimensions of language reclamation. So we're going to go through this today in the presentation. So before we do so, I want to give a sense of urgency to why Indigenous language reclamation in the current era that we live in is so important. And I want to give a little background to the community I serve, both as a member of, but also as a co-producer of knowledge, as a student, and also as a researcher. So my community is divided by the transborder area. And unfortunately, in the United States, we have less than 100 speakers. And this clear divide of, or this clear lack of speakers is also divided by the age of each individual speaker, which at the moment is soaring over 68 years old. So we can observe that clear disconnection between the elder generation and the youth. And, given that this is a space where we enjoy talking about Indigenous epistemology, but also about Indigenous leadership and Indigenous resistance, I want to be very clear in the way I speak that the language shift experienced by Indigenous communities in the present day is, in fact, by no mistake whatsoever, by neocolonial subordination imposed by the countries surrounding us as sovereign Indigenous people. And that's Mexico and the United States, Mexico y los Estados Unidos. And in that same framework, I'm utilizing Shannon Speed, who is a Chickasaw scholar at UCLA. And she uses this framework to understand that neocolonial subordination doesn't just involve the effects of Spanish colonists, but that influence, that foundation of colonialism spreads into present day nation states, which at the moment have continued to actively oppress Indigenous sovereignty, right? With the intent to eliminate, replace, and dispossess Indigenous peoples, languages, and traditions. So moving from that section and using it as foundational to my work, I want to hint at what Leanne Hinton, who's a linguist at Berkeley, said. It is the utmost critical time for Indigenous communities in the present day to revitalize and preserve their languages. So with that sense of urgency, I want to move on into my presentation. And before I do so, I want to talk about something that we as Indigenous people in the transborder area and as Indigenous people as a whole worldwide are very familiar with, unfortunately, and that is diaspora. From 1884 to 1909, Yoeme in northern Mexico and the Southwest in the United States experienced the neocolonial policies led by the Porfirio Díaz, el Porfiriato in Mexico, and backed by the US administration here in the Southwest. And that combination of deportations, homicides, massacres, slave labor, and genocide led to a decrease in population by at least 82%. And this is something that's been, testified, accounted for through numbers, data, military accounts by the former Raquel Padilla Ramos, and also by Edward Spicer in the past. And this is a framework that I think is very necessary, at least from an anthropological perspective, and given the sense that I'm using an anthropological perspective, both in the sciences and in the humanities, I want to make it very clear that my stance in analyzing what happened here in the Americas is a genocide under the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention, which was proposed by Raphael Lemkin in 1943. So with that in mind, like I said, I want to make it very clear that the things that our people have experienced here in the Americas cannot be described by any other terminology. I'm going to go a little bit just for historical background on some of the things that I've been able to analyze from El Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico. Some direct quotes that became nation state policy, and it became international decrees between the US and Mexico. And there were, state sponsored, nation state sponsored, and binational state sponsored decrees formulated by Diaz himself. Here I have a quote. I translated this quote into the English language, but when we present in Spanish, we are going to have the original transcript. But essentially, Diaz became the judge and executioner of this nation state genocide, or as he called it, a war of extermination against the Yoeme. He said, there should be no Yaquis left. Whatever Yaqui is left in Sonora will be considered rebellious and treated as such. And it was to his judgment, and only his judgment, the initiation of a war of extermination against the Yaqui. So the aspect that most stands out about this regime, not only is the hostility against indigenous people, but the way it became an affair of international matter, which, as we understand, indigenous people across the globe have suffered from being and residing in lands that become of economic interest to neocolonial and capitalist societies. So now I want to move into my case study, which I find it very, which is foundational to the work that I'm doing. So previously we have talked about how it is kind of ironic the way we utilize the word healing when it comes to talking about language, almost as if it's some sort of mystique, metaphorical word that can just be thrown around. But I previously was not able to grasp to what extent is language reclamation and language revitalization important for the subjects who are seeking to revitalize and reclaim their language. So a little background here. Essentially, the case study revolves around a diasporic community of Yoeme living in LA County in Los Angeles, California. And the reason why this case study is important and relevant, aside from many reasons, but the Yaqui in Los Angeles County are the second largest federally recognized group served by Tribal TANF, which is the Tribal Assistance for Native Families. And it's even more incredible when you put it to perspective that Los Angeles here in the United States is the city with most Native people. So thankfully I had plenty of people to rely on to perform these cultural interventions that our program consisted of. This is, unfortunately, because of time, I won't be able to cover all the theoretical aspects, the literature review and some of these things. But essentially, one of the foundational pieces that I'm using of linguistic anthropology is the need for language ideological clarification, which was coined by Paul Croskerty. And essentially, there is this need to clarify beliefs and feelings of tribal members towards their heritage language because of the influence that has plagued these communities, right? But at the same time, it is very important that we examine the way these communities feel about their language and the way they express it as they reclaim it, because it promotes indigenous agency awareness. And on top of that, it promotes aspects that the community had been missing, granted that they had been living in a diasporic setting. So touching a little bit more on the aspect of agency and awareness, I want to touch a little bit on the idea of critical language documentation, as it's phrased by Aaron Davenport. So Aaron Davenport has stressed that there is this incredible amount of understanding and light to be learned and shared in the aspect of knowledge that is limited, right? And she uses this definition based on the definition of secrecy, right? But why is this important? Because histories of a diaspora talk about people concealing and hiding their identity for protection. We have to remind ourselves that the Yoeme, in the times that they lived, and going off of the quotes that we read, which were international decrees, and the reduction of population by 82%, we can understand why it was necessary for indigenous Yoeme to hide their identity as they spread from the Southwest, from the Sonoran Desert. So in that concealment of identity, we have a lot to learn as ethnographers, as researchers, but as people interested, but as well as people interested in language reclamation, because it gives us an insight into what exactly was going through people's minds, why was it important, and what aspects of their indigeneity still survive till this day. I touched a little bit about this, but now I'm moving a little bit more into the aspect of examining historiographies, examining stories of agency, stories of awareness in a diaspora. And this is very important because going off of what Alice Taft has previously stated, there is this very important aspect which has been ignored for very long by the academy, that gaining and regaining an access to cultural resources, whether that's stories, songs, association, and all of them are tied down to language. In the aftermath of an imposed diaspora, they provide and revive linguistic and cultural knowledge that have been proven in different cultural interventions to having a positive emergent progress in the health and well-being of its indigenous seekers. So using that framework, I want to bring in this concept that was coined by Felicia Hodge, who is a professor of medicine, but also public health at UCLA, and she is also Native American from a California tribe up in the Pacific Coast. But she has stressed the idea of cultural circles, this idea of circles and promoting well-being as an activity, as a collective. And this really changed the dynamic in which I approach language revitalization, in the sense that I was no longer focused on creating a curriculum that applied to everybody, but I was focused on a curriculum that was addressing the specific needs of each individual. But it was shared amongst different individuals. So we were able to reach a different understanding, a different perspective, and it was utilized as a collective. I'm gonna go ahead and skip to this because I'm running out of time. So I want to get to the data. This is our most up-to-date survey that we perform. And essentially this survey, which is based on a quantitative approach, expands on this idea of people coming together and forming what in anthropological terms has been described as a social network of benefit, of access to knowledge, of access to companionship, of access to friendship, and the promotion of building well-being, of building community, and of building, established trade routes that had been, previously non-existent. In this survey, we were able to utilize one of our language tools, which happens to be a language and cultural board game. And in this utilization of language reclamation, we had 175 of the 203 people who participated in these activities report feeling better after attending the classes and partaking in the activities. But what's more precise of this is the aspect that a lot of these people who happen to be youth, who had been going through troubling times, whether that was psychological interventions for stress, depression, anxiety, suicide prevention, reported a lower of dosage of medication, or just the complete eradication of medication from their medical and mental health experts. And these letters were given to us, and it's something that's very encouraging, and it's currently a work in the process, it's brewing. So unfortunately, I can't, because of IRB reasons and because of so many personal and just works in the progress, I can't share more about that aspect. But so far our case study has been very very promising. So I asked the question, and again, I'm sorry, I know I'm running out of time. Does language revitalization impact health and well-being? So these are some of the results that we have been able to experience from our quantitative case study. And I use an indigenous definition of what it means to describe well-being, wellness. So the indigenous concept of wellness is understood as mental, physical, spiritual, but also emotional, right? And we see this interconnection of what has been described before, language as medicine. Now, this concept of language as medicine and healing makes more sense if we place this indigenous concept of well-being as mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. And what we have found in our quantitative analysis is that revitalization, or working in this cluster of assemblages, is that revitalization helps provide an avenue of dealing with problems in the present, problems in the past, with a different mindset. And it has been characterized as, again, by Alice Taff, as gaining an awareness or waking into a consciousness of existing values that are interconnected to our culture and to our cosmology as Indigenous people. I'm gonna go ahead and power through these. I wanted to share some of the interviews that we were able to conduct in our quantitative analysis. The names have been changed, obviously, for specific reasons, privacy. But these are some of the quotes, and I'm only going to read just a few bits and pieces. But essentially, we can see a pattern of students saying, "I have purpose. No one can take that away from me. I feel in control of my life, both emotionally and mentally. And participating in the language classes gives me a purpose and strength that I need to look forth to another day." And this was a person who had been undergoing treatment for suicide prevention. They had attempted to end their life a couple of times. So these were very promising results that we started seeing in our cultural interventions. I'm gonna power through this. This is again very theoretical. And I want to conclude with saying that so far our case studies have involved Southern California and Central California. However, there is this very promising ideology that we could continue to expand our research as we approach more cultural interventions and devote more time to this. Anything from using cultural resources, both online and in person, have allowed us to reach a greater network of people. So with that in mind, I know it was very brief. I wasn't able to fully invest myself into a biological perspective, and I was very brief in the linguistic perspective, but I want to thank precisely Cindy, Christian, you know, the people, the indigenous communities of Mexico, Tepic, Sonora, and the indigenous people here in the land I'm residing, Los Angeles, the Tongva. And I also want to extend my gratitude to my family, my parents, my greater extended family, my grandparents, and to my advisors here in UCLA for allowing me both to better prepare myself. Paul Croskery, Aaron Davenport, Shannon Speed, Abigail Bigham, and Eric Cardinal. So thank you again for everything, and I hope I can continue learning more as we move along.
There you go. Thank you, César, for that wonderful presentation. And now we want to take some time to ask questions. I know that probably everyone watching this will want to know a lot. Give us your contact information. And I just have one question, and I hope that we can frame these maybe like 5-10 minutes of conversation as a Q&A, but also kind of like a just like a talk that we can even ask. I know César and Christian can ask each other questions on campus, but hopefully we can use some time for asking questions online too, so that we can hear your thoughts. So for me, I have just a major general question, and that is, what can La Red FOLINAY learn from both of you, especially knowing the research that you both do? Christian with the ideas of erasure of indigenous ideologies inside literature and history too. Like, what can we learn from you and your research, and then from César, what can we learn in terms of language reclamation for Tepic, and then for a lot of indigenous communities in Mexico? All of these topics, those two topics are really new, right? Like, I don't think we have used in La Red FOLINAY that language reclamation, not yet. So my question is just very general. What can we learn? And then, I don't know, Christian, if you want to jump in, and then we move with César, or César, how do you all feel?
I guess I'll go. Yeah, I guess what I really want out of learning, from my presentation, is I want people to understand of how, history impacts the present. In both the US and Mexico, there have essentially been this idea of essentially, kind of moving forward, progressing, forward and stuff like that. I mean, that's just the liberal mindset of, progressing forward. But you can't progress forward, or that word is problematic in itself. This idea of progress, of what is progress, like who defines it? And that is the problem with this entire liberal project and this book about El Zarco, that for progress, for indigenous people to progress as a people, to almost evolve, because essentially they're essentially using like evolutionary terms. This is essentially what it means, is that for indigenous people to evolve, they must go away from their so-called dialectos. This idea, this is ingrained that this is not a full language, that these are primitive people. But the thing is, you had people like, Benito Juarez and Ignacio Altamirano that attained like the highest levels of power in Mexican society. But that's because they were given this opportunity and access to it, through capital, through resources and all that stuff like that. So you can only imagine what the possibilities could be if indigenous communities had access to this, but refocused it and recentered it in a way that, centered their own, cosmologies, their traditions, their ideas of, the way to see the land, the, people, society, the economy, politics, what have you. So I guess what I want to get to that is, I want people to see that, that these type of ideas started at a certain place and they need to be unpacked. And so it's very necessary that you first, find out what they are, try to, see where does this, this disconnect happen? Where does this erasure begin, and how you can do something about combating it, and not just essentially, saying, oh, we can ignore the past, which is impossible, because I mean, the past is what essentially, tells us what our present is. It is what lets Indigenous people know who they are as a people, because they know their past. And that is exactly why it is necessary to read something like El Zarco and see, its problematic ideals, and then essentially saying, this is how the Mexican state was, but it's not how it should be. And you can get into other debates about, about the whole problematic, about the whole nation state and stuff like that, and how it, obviously it, by necessity, it destroys, cultural linguistic plurality. But at the current moment, at least there should be at least some measures to allow Indigenous people to have more agency and autonomy over, at the very least, their own education, and how they can teach their own cultures and languages. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Cesar, what do you think? I would love to hear your thoughts. And Christian, if you have a question for Cesar, go ahead, go for it.
Yeah, no. First, I want to thank our friends, our relatives from La Red. We, as people of the Sonoran Desert, I feel very, very blessed to be presenting in this type of event, and I'm very excited to, I provided my email in my PowerPoint, so if any of you want to reach out to me that way, feel more than free, please. I would love to get to connect with more friends and people working on aspects of, Indigenous reclamation, sovereignty, promotion of Indigenous well-being. So with that in mind, I think that for too long we have used this idea of language and its properties of healing as just an abstract idea, as almost like a metaphor. But we haven't really sat and taken the time to say, are there really any biological implications that show us that Indigenous language reclamation has to be taken more seriously by the nation state, has to be taken more seriously by health experts, by those providing funding? Because this is something that, unfortunately, anyone who has invested in language reclamation will tell you that one of the biggest issues is funding. You're gonna find a lot of people with good hearts willing to devote their time, willing to give to the community by sharing what they know and learning and supporting one another. But unfortunately, we know that as Indigenous people, one of the biggest issues we have in keeping these programs alive is funding, because I'm a strong believer that these teachers, these possessors of knowledge that share their time and give freely, they should be compensated for that. And I think it is the responsibility of the nation state, both in Mexico and both in the United States, to treat these people, these teachers, as such, as cultural barriers of knowledge, and they should be sponsored by the nation state as a form of support, but not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because these Indigenous nations have been predating colonial contact. So it's one of the very things they can do at the very least, in my opinion. So building off of that, my work and what I seek to do is prove that there are biological implications in reversing and understanding the capabilities that language reclamation has in the human epigenetic and epigenomic structure, right? And the only way we can do that is through biological implications, such as biomarkers measuring, cortisol, stress, anxiety, genes that are associated with these hormones in the human body. So that's what I want to. That's my goal for my future research, to expand on the implications to what extent does language reclamation have on its heritage language learners, and to bring more awareness to the nation state, because we as Indigenous people know the power it has on our people of correcting and bringing us back. But we want to show the government what are the implications of it. And once we can say this needs to become an aspect of health and medical funding for Indigenous communities. So that's my goal in that sense.
Thank you, César and Christian, for sharing your amazing research. I think we have a lot of conversations coming. I think that I can think now of how many ways of connecting you from to the community so that we can discuss all of these topics. I don't know if you have any questions for each other, if you want to say some last words. I don't know, Christian, César.
I do have actually a question for César. So is that okay? Yeah. So yeah, so Tlaxcomati Niak, César, great presentation, and I want to thank obviously Red FOLINAY, Cindy, the communities in Nayarit, for having this amazing, conference, and I'm very honored and blessed. So yeah, especially from someone, from my family and my cultural heritage is from, the indigenous people of Guerrero. It's a little bit different, but I'm still very honored. So César, in regards, I have a question. I mean, you can kind of keep it brief because it's a little bit of a longer question than I thought of it. This is me as a historian that I'm really interested in. So in regards to the diaspora, the diaspora and identity, can you provide a brief history of the initiatives done or are being done by the Yoeme in acculturating members of the diaspora to their Yoeme heritage and roots?
Yeah, and I want to throw it back at you. You did a great job. Granted that we're colleagues, we're going to have plenty of dinner discussions moving forward. So again, thank you for both of you for sharing space with me. Yeah, so this is a very very intricate question. Here in the United States, it's very intricate because we have the politics of recognition that people like Kim Talbert have talked about, right? When it comes to the idea of what it means to be Indigenous in recognition by the government and what it means to be Indigenous by recognition of your own community. And unfortunately, here in the United States, we have approximately close to 30,000 enrolled Yoeme members, fairly recognized tribal members by the United States in what is known officially as Yoeme Pueblo and the Pascuayaqui tribe in Arizona. But we have more than 250,000 descendants stemming out of those 30,000 enrolled members. And we have so many more people living in the diaspora across the United States. So it is a very complicated question addressing how we historically approach connecting to our heritage. But one thing that I do know that has been successful, at least from utilizing platforms such as social media, is, there's something that attracts heritage language learners, and I'm using the term heritage language learner in the sense that these are people reclaiming their ancestral knowledge and ancestral heritage, and that's a question that I pose to myself, right? What attracts people to language revitalization? Because as you and I know, we could be doing so many things with our time in the afternoon. I mean, we come back from work, and we have families, we have responsibility. The last thing we want to do is open up our computer or go drive an hour to go sit on a cultural class, right? Why do people do this? Why do they make an effort and take time out of their day to do this? So this is like a very important question that for me requires an assessment of historiography and ethnography to comprehend what is attracting people into their heritage, right? In order to be able to assess and better comprehend what are we doing successfully and what are we doing not so successfully, right? So that's a very it's a very good question, and it's one of the questions that I'm still working on.
Thank you, César, for that question. I don't know if there's any more questions. I know that we can continue talking, and I want to allow for that space now if you all have questions, and if not, then I'm going to invite you all to, we will meet again, and then we'll record this in Spanish so that we have access for those who speak Spanish. But also I want to invite you both, hopefully in the summer, to talk about your research within, the community, because I know that La Red will be fascinated and will have a lot of questions about the work that you both are doing, because language revitalization, right? And also because of the ideas of erasures of indigenous languages and in languages speakers in general. I'm gonna pause for a moment. I don't know if there's last minute questions, César or Christian. We're okay. I know you will continue those conversations. I want to thank you both for joining me today. This panel has been very informative. I know that I didn't mention what was the title for a gathering, but it's Sustaining Indigenous Liveliness through La Red FOLINAY Symposium of Indigenous Language of Nayarit, Mexico. And I know that we will continue the conversations, and I just want to thank you for your time and thank you for sharing. This is really important research that I know it will be, will continue to evolve, and I want to support your work, and I want to continue being around. So let's continue these conversations offline and or in person when we are together in Mexico. Thank you again. I'm going to stop the recording now.